Hello, folks. We'll wait for people to sort of file in virtually as they do via Zoom before we get started, but welcome to this session that I am really looking forward to. And I know that we will all learn a great deal from. And since my part is probably the least interesting of everything, and I want to leave time for questions, I will actually get us started, knowing that this will leave as much time as possible for Martin. So my name's Fiona Miller. I'm a professor of health policy in the Institute of Health Policy Management and Evaluation at the University of Toronto. I direct the Center for Sustainable Health Systems here at U of T, and also a national initiative for climate action and awareness in healthcare called Cascades, that is funded by Environment and Climate Change Canada. And before we get to the subject at hand, I'd like to begin by acknowledging that for thousands of years, the land on which the University of Toronto operates and on which I live has been the home to the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and more recently the Mississaugas of the Credit River. And I'm very thankful for the opportunity to live and work on these lands. So we're hosting a series of seminars that are aimed at catalyzing research interest at the intersection between health services and systems research on the one hand, and sustainability science of various sorts on the other. And this is supported by a Connaught Global Challenge Award from the University of Toronto. Why, you might ask? The answer is because health and health systems are profoundly affected by climate change, although not the focus of much sustainability research. Healthcare also comprises a significant proportion of the global economy. It's a resource intensive and highly polluting service sector, but it's also a very critical contributor to productive and fair societies. So the healthcare community and the health sector as a whole has a role to play, an important role to play, I would argue, in addressing the climate challenge. And research is one of the things that's going to be needed to inform that role, research that crosses disciplines and sectors. And so this seminar series really tries to galvanize some of that. And today's session is in collaboration with the Canadian Centre for Health Economics. And I want to thank Dr. Rebecca Hancock-Howard for her help in coordinating this. And now I'd like to introduce the main event, Martin Hensher, who's our special guest today, joining us from Australia, from down under. He's the Henry Baldwin Professorial Research Fellow in Health Systems Sustainability at the Menzies Institute for Medical Research at U of T. Martin has more than 30 years of experience as a healthcare policymaker and health economist. He worked in the English National Health Service and as a senior economic advisor to the UK Department of Health. He was a consultant for the World Bank in Central Asia, for the European Commission, and for the South African National Department of Health, and also as a senior executive in the Tasmanian Department of Health. And so he has quite an extraordinary array of practical expertise to draw upon for his research that focuses on the economics and the organization of sustainable health systems for the future, using insights and principles from ecological economics, insights and principles that aren't typically drawn on in health economics. So really an intellectual resource and treasure for those of us really thinking about work at this intersection. And with that, I'll pass it over to Martin with thanks for your participation.
Thank you, Fiona. Good afternoon to you all. Good morning here. Let me just get my slides up and then we'll go from there. Okay, are those slides looking all right, Fiona, just to double check?
Perfect.
Good, good. All right, so thank you, everybody. It's a great pleasure to be talking to you. Thank you to Fiona and her team for inviting me. I'm speaking to you from Hobart in Tasmania. So I'd like to acknowledge the peoples of the Lutruwita nations here and the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin nation on the mainland, as the traditional owners of the lands where I've been doing this work, and I pay my respects to their elders past, present and future. So Fiona's told you a little bit about me. I've been incredibly fortunate to have what you might call a diverse career in fascinating places. The constant really in most of my career has been health on the one hand and economics on the other. So in one way or another, I've always really been working around health and health economics and how that comes together, mainly as a policymaker and decision maker, but always keeping a toe in the water kind of with research. And I've been very fortunate in recent years to be able to kind of make the jump across from government into academia, first at Deakin University in Melbourne, and then this year coming back home, as it were, to the University of Tasmania. So during that sort of journey, and particularly maybe in the last kind of 10 or so years, particularly after the global financial crisis, I was kind of aware personally of quite a bit of, let's say, increasing interest in heterodox thinking in economics, as well as also kind of new ways of thinking that were starting to come up about planetary health, for example, the growth in interest in sustainable healthcare, which, whilst it's really taken off in the last few years, I think probably, you know, has been getting going for a good 10 years or so. And on the economic side, I just began almost by chance, really, I think, to sort of stumble into some writings about ecological economics, which certainly wasn't something I'd studied as an undergraduate, let's say, in my undergraduate economics degree, feminist economics, and also, again, following the GFC, modern monetary theory. So that was all terribly interesting. And, you know, as you do for a while, I was reading this stuff on the side and finding it very interesting. But I was kind of feeling I wasn't seeing much evidence of this impacting on my day job, and particularly these kind of newer ways of thinking about health certainly weren't really showing up in the kind of policy spaces that I was working in. But at the same time, during that same period of this last decade, the one thing I was seeing more of was the impacts of climate change, very locally and directly. So you can see me down in the right-hand side in my stylish orange suit. I'm a search and rescue volunteer. I guess the first thing that really made me think hard about this was the Dunalley fire, which was a huge bushfire which destroyed a small town on the east coast of Tasmania. The people in the picture there were very famous. They survived by wading out into the sea and clung onto the pier to survive while the town burned. And we searched that town after the fire. Incredibly, nobody was killed, but that's certainly got me thinking. And since then, we've just seen more and more and more of these climate-related extreme weather impacts. And these are just pictures all of places that I know and care about, but we're seeing them across the world. So that really, I think, started me thinking about, well, what do I need to do about this? How can I bring this to bear, kind of in my day job or in having an influence on this stuff? So perhaps not the most obvious thing to do in retrospect, but I decided I'd do a PhD. And I did a PhD on health system sustainability, subtitle New Perspectives from Macroeconomics and Ecological Economics. And other things being equal, my graduation is on Tuesday. So we're very much hoping that everybody in the family keeps away from COVID between now and then. And that's going to be a fantastic way to finish that journey. And then I've been very fortunate in that I was able, as I said, to get a job at Deakin University at their Institute for Health Transformation, where we set up a sustainable health network, really starting to get working on sustainable health and healthcare. And then this year came back to Hobart, where the University of Tasmania have done a really fantastic, brave thing, I think, in giving me a bit of freedom to set up a research program on health system sustainability. And my focus areas really are about sustainability in the wider sense of economic, environmental, and societal sustainability, and particularly to develop really what I'm calling an ecological health economics concept, so applying ecological economics to health and to health economics. And just in today's talk, I'm going to really give you a very brief overview of some of that, introduce some key ideas from ecological economics and how they might apply to health and healthcare, or what they might mean for health and healthcare. Focus a bit particularly on what they might mean for health economics, and then really wrap up by thinking particularly about how health economists might make a positive contribution to sustainability, both climate change and other ecological issues in healthcare. And I would say that the more work I've done in this area, strikingly, with a few honourable exceptions, some of whom I will name later, but health economists haven't been particularly active in developing the ideas of sustainable healthcare in the last few years. So I'm very keen, as a kind of long-standing health economist, to see how we could do better as a discipline. So for those who are watching, this presentation is fairly economics focused, but it's not going to be technical. So please don't worry if you're not, if you're not a qualified economist, if such a thing actually exists, you will be able to follow. But unashamedly, though, I'm going to be talking about economics angles of most of these things. So let's start off just by introducing ecological economics, and in particular, kind of what are some key differences between ecological economics and neoclassical economics. Neoclassical economics being the kind of dominant orthodoxy of economics today, not to be confused with neoliberalism, which is an ideological project, but neoclassical economics really is the kind of the conventional school of economic thinking, which has been dominant for at least 100 years. I'm not going to kind of go through a huge compare and contrast, but there's a couple of critical differences that actually make it much easier to understand. So under neoclassical economics, the way most economists still think about the world, nature, or the ecosystem, is actually conceptualized as a sector within the economy. So in particular, we talk specifically about the natural resources sector. That's the sector where we mine things. That's the sector where we chop down trees and turn them into timber. That's the sector where we fish, fisheries, etc. So the ecosystem is seen as a subsystem of the economy. And at the same time, neoclassical economics does recognize, obviously, that economic processes cause waste and pollution, etc. But they're viewed simply as externalities to the exchanges going on in the economy. So that's the neoclassical view. By contrast, the ecological economics view, and this is kind of articulated by the man who's more than others probably did most to drive forward ecological economics as a discipline, which is a chap called Herman Daly, who is still active in the field, well into his 80s, but really did a lot of the heavy lifting in the early days of ecological economics. He conceptualized it a bit differently. He said, look, no, that's a ridiculous way of thinking about things. Ultimately, the world, human existence, is constrained by the laws of physics, and in particular, the laws of thermodynamics. And as a result, whatever we do in the economy is actually a subsystem of the wider ecosystem. If there's no natural world, there's no economy. So he reconceptualized it in the way that you can see in this diagram. So the economy is a smaller subsystem of the wider ecosystem, with solar energy going in, which obviously then causes us to be able to utilize all kinds of resources from the ecosystem, which come out of the other side in terms of dissipated energy and waste matter, and that the purpose of the economy is to meet human welfare. And human welfare is met not only by the economic services of the things we make in the economy, but also actually by the ecosystem itself, by the ecosystem services which nature provides for us. And For a long time in human history, so Daly would argue, that was okay. There were not that many people, and the economy and the pressures that the economy placed on the wider natural world was actually quite limited. But as in the more recent past, in the last couple of 100 years, as the economy started to grow very fast, as the human population also started to grow very fast, the economy has kind of metaphorically and literally started to take up more and more space within the ecosystem as we've moved to what Daly called a full world, where human impacts, and really human impacts and the economy are more or less the same thing, just is consuming more and more of the Earth's natural resources, to the extent now that, you know, as I think as most people probably have heard, the stat, we and our livestock are by far the overwhelming source of biomass now on the planet, for example. So that's the full world. And then that then obviously can start to be a problem. In particular, if as we move into that full world, we are starting to rub up against what some people have called planetary boundaries, what others before them maybe called limits to growth. But pretty simply, the idea that we are actually moving into danger zones in terms of consumption of critical natural resources on the one hand, and pollution and destruction of other natural resources on the other. I was very irritated yesterday night because I just saw that somebody's actually done an update of this planetary boundaries diagram, which sort of fills in various of these segments more, but I didn't have time to put it in, but that's out there. But it's a sort of figurative representation, the planetary boundaries idea of how humanity is beginning to nudge us into danger zones in various areas. And it's really important, I think, throughout this talk, you know, much of what I'm going to talk about will kind of circle back to climate change, because that's the big, I think, the big thing in most people's consciousness that perhaps most effort is being made about. But it's really important to acknowledge that there's a much wider ecological crisis affecting lots of other dimensions. And the thing about this full world and how we're pushing up against planetary boundaries is that this is deeply unequal, and many would say deeply unjust. So these two little diagrams showing you the donut diagram, which very simply, the middle of the diagram on the left-hand side of Australia, the blue part of this diagram is about, shows us how well we're achieving various aspects of human well-being. And the blue in there shows that Australia is meeting human needs very well. But then the outer edge of this donut, the red there in Australia, shows that we here are transgressing lots of planetary boundaries. On the right-hand side is Sri Lanka. They're not doing so well inside the donut. They've got quite a bit of red in there. They're not meeting human needs in all the ways that they could. But equally, nor are they blowing out their planetary boundaries allocation, if you like. And this is a story across the world. The high income countries have caused most of the damage and are the ones whose footprint, both carbon and other kinds of ecological footprint, is pushing us towards those planetary boundaries, whereas low income countries have not caused the problem, but are not in a position to meet the needs of their people yet. And that's, again, equity and inequity is really central to all of these debates. So coming back to ecological economics, which is really, I think, particularly Daly, but many of those working with him at the time, was really trying to bring in some of those concepts there, but particularly this flipping that the economy sits within the ecosystem rather than the other way around. And that moved us from the traditional view of economics, which is, you know, not, I don't think, particularly controversial, that economics is the study of the allocation of scarce resources among unlimited wants. That's the kind of neoclassical economics view of what economics is for. Allocating resources, which are limited, between people and unlimited wants. Different areas of heterodox economics have started to push against that over many years, and particularly really taking on board the concept that the economy and what we're doing is a social phenomenon. It's not just a kind of natural given that came out of nowhere. The economy is a human and social creation, and how we run the economy is very much created by society. So heterodox economics broadly looks much more as economics as the study of the social creation and social distribution of society's resources. But then ecological economics really takes that a step further and identifies three key kind of domains of economics. And I think this is why I've found this particularly compelling, really, as why I think ecological economics has something really significant to offer. So ecological economics is concerned with these three core things: sustainable scale, fair distribution, and efficient allocation. So sustainable scale is the big thing that makes it different from other approaches to economics. Put very simply, ecological economics is directly concerned with how much is enough and actually how much is too much. When does economic activity actually become damaging? And none of the other approaches to economics really look at this question of when could the economy be too big. So scale is the particular differentiating factor of ecological economics. It's also explicitly concerned with fair distribution, both at the individual level, but particularly about equity and fairness within and between nations and between those who have caused the ecological crisis to a greater extent historically and those whom it most impacts. But then, of course, it is also very directly related to efficient allocation, that kind of the original, uncontroversial goal of economics. And in fact, both technical and allocative efficiency become ever more important the more we find ourselves working under ecological constraints. So the final concept from Daly and the kind of from the origins of ecological economics, which I just want to run through, which it's important to understand, is he developed what I have found an incredibly useful concept, which he called uneconomic growth. And this dressed up with a complicated looking diagram, but it's actually a pretty simple idea. And I'll show you this diagram, which of his, which is perhaps makes it a little bit simpler to see. So as the economy grows, the horizontal axis, and when I say as the economy grows, all that means is as the size of the economy, the number and value of transactions increases. So as we buy and sell more stuff, literally, through the economy, that's all economic growth is, increasing output. So as the economy grows, to begin with, that growth has huge benefits. We have very high marginal utility of each extra unit of output gets us a lot of benefit. At the same time, whenever you create something, you're going to have some negative consequences. You can't make anything without using energy, without causing some degree of pollution or waste. So we also create some of what was called disutility. And over time, as the economy grows, so Daly says, sorry, just getting rid of one of those alarming, your computer is about to restart messages. I hope, can you see that on the screens or not, or is that in the way?
Not there, it's perfect.
Not there, that's good. Okay, that's good. That always gives you a frisson of fear, doesn't it, when those come up at the wrong time? But I've got an hour and a half according to it. But as the economy is growing, the utility that economic growth is creating steadily goes down, diminishing marginal returns, which, as far as I'm concerned, if there is a real law in economics, it's the law of diminishing marginal returns. But the disutility goes up, the pollution, the crowding, the destruction of natural environments, etc., increases until you get to a point, says Daly, where the marginal utility of growth crosses over with the marginal disutility of growth. And after that point, the disutility is beginning to exceed the utility you get from growth. And ultimately, conceptually, you could actually get to a point where continuing to expand the economy doesn't give you any more benefit, it's just giving you disutility. We're not there yet, but a crucial question is, where have you reached that point where economic growth becomes uneconomic growth? And I'll show you later how I found that a kind of a helpful concept actually in some healthcare settings and discussions. So all this has taken ecological economists. Now, there's a huge amount of work that people have been doing in this field for over 30 years, so I'm not going to attempt to kind of condense it all down, but they've kind of taken many of these concepts and particularly become concerned about growth. And you will find in many of the more recent writings that really growth and the future of growth is a constant preoccupation in ecological economics. And there's a great, it's in the references to these slides, but there's a really good, very recent article from Lancet Planetary Health, just came out at the beginning of this month, by Lena Brand-Correa and colleagues, which is a sort of an introduction to ecological economics for a public health audience. And I'd commend that as a really good kind of piece of reading to get started on the general concepts of ecological economics, if you're interested in this. But what a lot of the debate about growth in ecological economics comes down to is whether we can, what they call decouple growth in GDP, gross domestic product, can we decouple growth from our environmental impacts, okay? And can we actually continue to grow our economy without destroying the environment, or to avoid ecological catastrophe, do we actually have to constrain or even stop or perhaps even reverse growth? And really at the moment, there's a big debate that has been going on for several years, which is well worth looking at just for your own interest, I think, about whether we can achieve what people call green growth, which is really the official narrative that most countries are signed up for, that we can decouple GDP growth from environmental harms, or whether that's actually misguided. And in fact, do we need new post-growth models, ideas like the steady state economy, like Kate Raworth's donuts with the little picture there, or do we need to go even further? And proponents of a school of thought called degrowth say that particularly in the high income countries, we do actually need to look at how we actively reduce the scale of some aspects of the economy in order to bring it to a sustainable state. And I think it's really important, and people sometimes shy away from this, but underlying all of this and why we need to be concerned about this is, of course, the concern that if we get it wrong, it's not just that we're damaging lots of natural environments, but that in doing so, we're actually setting ourselves up as the human race for potentially disastrous disruption and collapse. So there we go, that's ecological economics in a very quick tour and some key concepts. You may be asking, that's great, what has this got to do with healthcare? So for the rest of the presentation, very quickly, I just want to try and say, explain how might we use some of these concepts and relate them to health and particularly healthcare, and maybe what are some of the opportunities in that space. So growth is very significant, and it's significant because even as we debate whether or not we should continue to grow the economy, in fact, globally, economic growth has been slowing down and down and down over the decades. But as that happens, healthcare has continued to consume a growing share of GDP. And growth is really important, and what happens to growth is really important for healthcare, because actually, since the Second World War, healthcare has continued to consume a greater share of GDP. It's the ultimate growth sector. We know all the things, demographics, etc., mean also that healthcare and related caring sectors like aged care, etc., need in a physical way to continue to grow, because demand for healthcare will continue to expand with an aging population. So healthcare is intimately linked with economic growth. And my thesis, and a lot of what drives me, is that running the reverse of that, if something happens to economic growth, we are very definitely going to feel it in the healthcare sector. So we need to understand what might be going on here. We've also known for a long time that healthcare displays diminishing marginal returns. And in fact, the most elegant sort of theoretical exposition of this is over 40 years old now. Avidis Donabedian looked at this idea of actually how you can have too much medicine. So that's not a new idea by any stretch of the imagination. And putting these things together with that concept of uneconomic growth has got me thinking and really trying to synthesize some of the different literatures on how healthcare actually can cause harm in different ways. One strand of what's going on here is that, as we all know, low quality healthcare can clearly cause harm to patients. Patients can come out of the healthcare system sicker, in some cases even dead, but certainly sicker than they were when they went in. That happens with some people. And when you start to actually look at the literature on the scale of those harms, they're actually pretty big. I'm not going to go all through these, but really non-trivial, kind of up to 15% or so of hospital admissions incurring an adverse event in both high income and low and middle income countries, for example. 15% of hospital expenditure related to dealing with the aftermath of adverse events in OECD countries. So there's a lot of harm happening within healthcare, which might make us cautious about, do we want to indiscriminately do more healthcare if actually a significant number of people might be harmed by doing so. At the same time, again, over the last decade, there's been a big growth in understanding of the scale and problems of overuse, overdiagnosis, overtreatment, low value care, lots of different names, but all really the same kind of thing: unnecessary, inappropriate, and non-beneficial care, which carries an inherent risk of doing harm to people, but without even any real scope for benefit. And again, really big big estimates of the potential scale of unnecessary care and overuse across different countries. So that's significant. And again, is that kind of a form of overconsumption and uneconomic growth beginning to become visible? And in one of the papers that I'll give you a reference to, I've sort of tried to develop some frameworks of how we can try to break down care between what is necessary and beneficial, what is unnecessary and non-beneficial, what are the kind of avoidable harms of that, what might be the unavoidable inherent risk, and then really think about how can we squeeze out that unnecessary, non-beneficial and avoidable harms as far as possible. And that then links to wider discussions, which I think are very critical, about more general overconsumption in the economy, and how that drives health harms. So again, this is a framework from one of my papers where on the left-hand side, there's all kinds of things going on in the wider economy, which technically we could describe as overconsumption or misconsumption, harmful consumption. But I think we are rightly increasingly describing in public health as the commercial determinants of health, the commercial drivers of health. Lots of production and consumption, which is directly causing damage to people's health, which, if you've got good access to healthcare, then drives you into the healthcare system. And that sets up what some have described as failure demand, which is a great concept, really. Failure demand being the costs or the need to fix up health damages which actually could have been avoided. So the fact that these people are presenting for healthcare is a failure. We could have prevented them from becoming sick. And that failure demand then drives into the healthcare system. And through those mechanisms I described of poor quality care and unnecessary and non-beneficial care, the health sector itself can create more harm and create its own loop of failure demand. So I think these are big there's huge amounts of work need to be done on this, but we shouldn't underestimate how much current and future demand for healthcare could potentially be prevented, and how critical is that for reducing the environmental impacts of the healthcare sector, which, as Fiona stated, in your typical high-income country, the healthcare sector is 10-ish% of GDP, and countries like UK, Canada, Australia, 5 to 7% of carbon emissions or CO2 emissions, for example, of the total economy. So healthcare is a big player in all of this, and it has lots of environmental impacts beyond clearly just greenhouse gas emissions. We use all kinds of chemicals which we put inside people and do things with, and those in their very different ways can end up back in the natural environment. So we also need to be thinking at every stage about how can we minimize the footprint, the ecological footprint of the health sector. And just to re-emphasize again, if you haven't read it already, it's dense, heavy going, etc. But the two recent IPCC reports, Working Group 2 on impacts, adaptation and vulnerability, which came out in February, and Working Group 3 on mitigation of climate change, which came out at the beginning of this month, do again have a look at them. Very stark impact and adaptation from a health perspective, saying very clearly the health impacts of climate change are already here with high confidence. We're seeing all kinds of health impacts already. And the mitigation people saying very bluntly, we're running out of time. And all the pathways they looked at, which limit warming to non-catastrophic scenarios, involve rapid, deep, and in most cases immediate greenhouse gas emission reductions in all sectors. And I put this in just because I still actually do occasionally meet people who go, oh, why does health have to do anything here? And it's, you don't even need to make an ethical argument here. Actually, as we move forward, healthcare systems are going to be made to do something about their ecological footprints. So we might as well get ahead of the game. So kind of on the home straight now, but how can we use ecological economics and combine it, particularly with what we already know in health economics, to better support climate and environmental action in the health sector? I put this in 4 buckets: mitigation, adaptation, resilience, and sufficiency. Now, people who are familiar with climate change work will certainly be familiar with the first 3. The sufficiency aspect maybe less so, but let's take a quick look. I hope you can see this all right. This is, I thought this was a great diagram, but unfortunately it's actually come out a bit small, as these things are wont to. But a really important move forward with that IPCC Working Group 3 report I just mentioned was they, for the first time, have really emphasized that work on sustainability across all sectors needs to focus both on what they call the demand side and the supply side. And a lot of the discussion that we've had in sustainable healthcare has actually really been about the supply side. That is, how can we produce healthcare in a greener and less environmentally damaging way? So how can we use renewables to power our healthcare systems? How can we reduce plastics waste, etc., which is critical, but has to be doubled up with the demand side. How can we actually reduce demand for healthcare, which, if you don't treat somebody, appropriately, if you can appropriately not give treatment to somebody, that's the easiest and quickest way to not cause an environmental impact, surely. And I think there's three things on the demand side that we really need to focus on. We need to focus much more on primary prevention, but within that, I think actually those commercial determinants of health and the wider health damaging overconsumption is much more important than kind of medical primary prevention. But how can we reduce future disease burden to reduce future healthcare needs? Second thing on the demand side is how can we do much better chronic disease management? How can we actually manage people better so that their resource use is lower and therefore the environmental impact of that resource use is minimized? And finally, how can we give people the right care? How can we minimize that overuse and overdiagnosis I was talking about? And incredibly, it's no coincidence that that's really the same thing as most decent national health strategies would be trying to achieve, because those are the things which also give people the best healthcare outcomes. But they potentially have an even bigger impact, I would suggest, on the future environmental impact of the healthcare sector than doing all the other absolutely critical supply side green production things that we also need to do to retool our health systems. What might that mean kind of for economics? What's the work for economics and particularly health economics in that space? So I think we need to up our game on economic evaluation and prioritization of prevention, chronic disease management, and overuse, overdiagnosis on the demand side. There's lots of great people doing good work in this space, but it's still very dominated, and I still find health economics quite dominated by cost effectiveness analysis and health technology assessment for products and interventions. And how can we really drive the centrality of this demand side work through better economic analysis? How can we measure the co-benefits of joint actions, of what are the improvements in health and the value of reduced environmental impacts? Co-benefits is a big area. Lots of people talking about it, not many people doing it well. And health economics absolutely has the tools to do co-benefits work really well. I think there's an economics piece about actually what does it mean to actually change the infrastructure and the production systems, etc., to reduce emissions. So what does green healthcare supply look like, and what are the economics of doing that? And then how do we incorporate negative externalities, the environmental impacts, into our economic evaluation, health technology assessments, etc. This is the area that where really health economists who are interested in this seem to be clustered around this, not surprisingly, because health technology assessment is the big game, I think, for health economics. But I think it's only one, it's an important, but it's actually only one probably smaller part of what the economics work needed here. And actually, I think the big one is going back to something that health economists were very good at, but is perhaps a bit out of fashion now, which is sectoral cost effectiveness analysis and really working on the kind of allocative efficiency across the whole sector, because I would foresee within a few years, health sectors in many countries are going to essentially be given a carbon budget in the same way as a public health system is given a financial budget, and you're going to have to manage within that carbon budget. And I think we've got the tools in health economics to help with the prioritization decisions of actually how to best use a healthcare carbon budget. Then we've got adaptation and resilience. That's all about really, adaptation is all about how we respond to the changes, particularly climate, but other ecological impacts that are already here or are already baked in. What do we need to do to make our systems able to survive, work effectively within them? One key stream of adaptation, which is important, which health economists can definitely contribute to, is the health impact side. What actually are the health impacts of climate change? And we're already seeing changes in vector-borne diseases, obviously all these increasing toll of sort of extreme weather events and disasters and stuff. There's some important economics work in there. There's also actually, I think, some really interesting economics work on changing the infrastructure, what do you actually have to do in technically, physically within healthcare systems. I haven't seen anybody working on that in health economics. But then the big one, back to growth, is actually what does health economics and financing look like if we are moving into a post-growth environment? There's interesting work on what post-growth welfare states might look at. Not much other than a couple of things I've written, not much looking explicitly at health, but a wider sort of group looking at welfare states in post-growth conditions. I think we need to kind of think more in economics about what we call real resource constraints. So not just the financial cost, but what physical resources are actually available. That's going to become an increasing problem for us. And we're already seeing that, I think, first with COVID, now with the war in Ukraine, supply chain disruption, etc. There's only going to be more of that over coming years. In a post-growth situation, cost effectiveness thresholds can only go one way, which is down. And I think they'll come down a lot from the kind of levels that we use currently in health technology assessment. I think there's huge amount of work in looking at that. And really, we have to work very hard on kind of how we strip out now rent-seeking, excess profits, etc., from healthcare systems. I'm not sure how much of a problem that is in the Canadian system. It's more of a problem than people want to admit in the Australian healthcare system, and it's obviously a huge problem in the US system. And then finally, actually, more work is desperately needed on how we value care and caring rather than just commodified technologies. I'm keeping an eye on the time. I want to have a little bit of time for discussion, so I won't dwell too much. But then resilience, which is, for me, is basically how can we make our healthcare systems survivable and able to cope under adverse circumstances. And honestly, there's a trade-off there with some of our current notions of technical efficiency, and we need to think about that. We need to think hard about that. And I think that probably has quite big implications for actually how we organize our healthcare systems. Can, highly leveraged for profit healthcare providers owned by hedge funds or whatever, can they actually be resilient? Probably not. Then sufficiency really comes to the question of how much is enough healthcare? Can there conceivably be too much healthcare? And look, very briefly, I've been doing some work looking at health expenditure and health outcomes across countries using a couple of measures: health adjusted life expectancy and mortality amenable to healthcare. And what we're finding is sort of whispers of perhaps, well, certainly there are diminishing returns to healthcare. What we see is, as you increase spending in the poorest countries, you get incredible rapid increases in health outcome. Beyond certain levels of spending, that starts to slow down. And then maybe at the highest levels of spending, certainly a sense that you're not really getting any more benefit for very high levels of spending. And maybe you're linked to possibly even worse outcomes. And with much more fragmentary data on healthcare system greenhouse gas emissions, similar kinds of pictures. You, at the moment, with current technologies, the systems with the lowest levels of emissions probably also have lower outcomes, probably because people don't have the level of access to care they need. But as you increase emissions, you reach a point beyond which additional healthcare emissions are not actually appearing to add to people's healthcare. So in terms of this sufficiency concept, really a lot of the world's population, much of the world's population have well below the level of access they need for a basic minimum standard of healthcare. But perhaps the richest might actually be spending too much, and spending in dollar terms or in physical resource terms, and achieving limited or maybe no benefit for that additional very high levels of spending. And that opens a lot of discussions that the ecological economists have been having about, are there actually kind of upper and lower consumption levels that we need to be in? The Kate Raworth's donut. How can we keep people inside the green donut there? But then the core question that comes out of that is, how can we create the ecological and the fiscal space to grow healthcare in low-income countries, whilst perhaps reducing healthcare and particularly healthcare footprint in high-income countries? So, look, this is moving very fast. And as I say, I've observed that health economists have been slow to get on board with climate change work and ecological work. And as that moves faster, the longer that health economics leaves it as a discipline, the further behind we're going to be left. Now, work is already happening. So, for example, health technology agencies in a number of countries are already starting to look at how might you incorporate environmental impacts into health technology assessment. But I guess my kind of pitch is we've got a wealth of skills and tools in health economics, which I think can really easily be repurposed to do this work. Maybe it's just who I am and I'm a product of my own kind of path, but you know, the rewards of being out at the frontier and the excitement and the interest of being at the frontier, doing stuff that we don't quite understand, is much greater to me anyway than the safe mainstream. And I'm sure there are other people out there who would feel that way. It's exciting. So it's something really interesting and exciting to do. And also, oddly, some of the founders of health economics overlap fascinatingly with people who founded ecological economics, people like Kenneth Arrow and Ken Boulding in particular. So that's really interesting. So it's challenging also for health economics. It's well outside people's comfort zones. I understand that. It's super interdisciplinary, which can be difficult in an academic environment rather, but we need to work on that. I won't go into this now, but I think also extra welfareism, which is a kind of a construct that's been important in health economics, that's dead now. Climate crisis, ecological crisis means we don't get to work in our own little world where only health and health economics matters. We're part of a bigger thing now with bigger constraints that are binding on us. And I think to actually be able to do some of this work, we're going to need to change some of our training approaches, a bit less focused exclusively on economic evaluation and very technical economic evaluation, more focused on broader economics, including, but absolutely not only, the ecological economics. And the big challenge there, of course, still is funding. And that's a real issue, but I do think that will catch up soon. You've got fantastic advantages in Canada. You've got very, very strong health economics capabilities already, which is great. You've got agencies in Canada and indeed health economists already beginning to work on some of this stuff. And I'd particularly shout out Adam Raymakers. I don't know if he's watching, but in British Columbia, who's started to do some work in this area. You're actually the home of some of the kind of founders of ecological economics, people like Peter Victor and Bill Rees, still going in Canada. And there's been a really great development of kind of the next generation of ecological economists in Canada. And also, you do have some of the, it's still a limited number, but the people who are working on health through kind of ecological economics and heterodox economics frames. You've got really good people here too. And I would name a couple of individuals I've worked with who are fantastic: Katie Kish and Catherine Zivert, active in this area. So you've got really good people here. And I think there's tremendous opportunities to be done. And with that, I will end.
Wow, that was amazing. Thank you so much. We do not have an hour and a half. So we have a lot of questions, and I'm not even quite sure how to pick from them, but maybe I'll grab a couple of questions that are about data challenges, both the data challenges in relation to thinking about climate and environmental impact to bring that into our modeling, but also an interesting question about what is analogous to QALYs in the negative environmental impacts kind of space. So did you want to speak to that?
Okay, so right, so let me just, yes, I better start writing these down, hadn't I?
We'll only be able to do a couple of questions, I think.
No, sure. Okay, so data, right, so data is really, that's a great question. So I mean, look, you know, there's so much to talk about. Let's maybe just think about climate, keep it simple. So interestingly, where we currently get our data from for kind of thinking about climate impacts or you know, emissions in healthcare, etc., is from two forms of analysis. So one which is called life cycle analysis or life cycle assessment, which is the sort of bottom-up approach where you're looking at particular products or processes, doing very detailed analysis of what, you know, what emissions are happening across all the different sort of parts of the product life cycle. The other is top-down input-output analysis, which fascinatingly actually uses economic input-output analysis tables, so that come literally from the economic statisticians, and, you know, sort of applies kind of factors for greenhouse gas emissions. So that data is kind of scarce, tricky, and often a bit rubbery. So in fact, a huge area for improvement is getting in. How do you do that? Very few health services kind of find it easy. Some are doing a bit better, but very few people find it easy to directly measure their emissions. For example, there's a lot of sort of imputation goes on. So that whole measurement piece is something that is ripe for kind of improvement, and you know, down the track, how do you turn it into metrics, all that kind of, you know, the usual stuff we do in health systems. So there's huge amounts there. Then yeah, look, QALYs outcomes. So look, the big debate, if anybody's going to the ISPOR conference, we have a session on this later actually. But it probably is in the middle of the night for you folks. I know our Canadian colleagues has sent in a recording because she'd be up at 3 a.m. to do her bit. But it boils down to, do you include the environmental impacts on the outcome side or on the cost side? On the outcome side, I think it's very complex. It takes us into all sorts of things. You know, yeah, you could have multi-criteria decision analysis and all that kind of stuff. But I would argue we maybe need to go back to basics more and see them more as these are they're negative externalized costs, and they're therefore a cost, and they probably need to go on the cost side. And various people, myself included, have done work to show that you can actually use the social cost of carbon to drive the negative externalities through the cost side of the equation. But again, years worth of research and development of how you might, how you might take different approaches there.
Well, since we're sort of out of time, I want to just ask, I'm going to take the privilege of the chair and just sort of ask in terms of moving forward concretely, in terms of the educational capacity, in terms of the training capacity. Are there international networks? What kind of collaborative opportunities exist, do you think? How are we going to help each other to build the sort of capacity we need today, when the professoriate, and I'm not a health economist, I'm a health policy person, but for the most part, the economics professoriate is not there yet. So what are your thoughts on how do we do this, maybe collaboratively or what's out there?
Great question. So I think, look, so it's a collaborative question at the moment. It's very early days. So we've been trying to build some, you know, still super informal, just, you know, partnerships of interested health economists. And we're kind of accumulating more people, starting to pick people up across, certainly across North America, Europe, Australasia, actually, you know, beginning to get a little bit of interest from people in lower and middle income countries too. That's still very informal. I think we've made better progress in Australia. We're building some broader networks generally of, you know, across all the disciplines of health and healthcare and sustainability. And my hope would be is to kind of carve out a health economics kind of
Pillar.
bit of that and build out. But yeah, look, I think we need, you know, we need to reach across, and we need, you know, and I'm trying to reach out to the ecological economics folk, and again, sort of very early kind of informal collaboration starting there. So I mean, I'd love to talk to people about how even just, you know, I mean, to say Australia, Canada, I mean, still actually just at the level of individuals and institutions, but, you know, how we might all work together on that and just do some thinking. How might we, for example, have a, you know, sustainability focused theme session at International Health Economics Association conference, for example? That might be, you know, that's the sort of way people build up these networks as well, isn't it? So I think there is room there. But as I say, my concern is there's such urgency here that we need to turbocharge this a bit now. So I'd just love to talk to people about how we can do that. Yeah.
Great. Okay. Well, I'm hoping that will be some of the outcomes of this, but I can't thank you too much, Martin, for this. This is absolutely wonderful. Thank you very, very much. I know people will have something else that need to go to. It's 7 a.m. for you. I'm sure you've got to get your day started. And thank you so much. This has been terrific. So goodbye.
Thank you all. Lovely to talk to you.
Okay, great. Bye-bye.